Welcome back, guys. In the previous video, I hot coated the longboard. In this video, I'm going to sand the longboard so then I can apply another coat of epoxy for the gloss coat. I also apply a pinstripe, and if you haven't checked out the previous videos of this build series, go check them out as well. The link is in the description below. Alright, the hot coat's done. It looks really good. Besides that, just that one little spot at the tail where it had the little issue of the older fiberglass. But it's like, it looks really white. The tint job came out really well as well. I'm pretty happy with that. Not perfect, but pretty good. Just maybe tiny blotchy in some spots. But it's on the deck. Some of it will be covered up by the wax. Now it's time to switch my stands back down to the shaping stands. I'm going to sand on that. Might be good to get some pads to put between the board and the stand so it doesn't slide around when I'm going to go to sand. I'm going to power sand this board. If you don't have a power sander, you can certainly sand it with like a palm sander. I've mentioned this in all my other videos. I recommend you go back and check out some of those videos on specifics on how to sand a surfboard. I'm just going to grab my power sander and just hit this and get her done. But before I do that, I'm going to cover everything up with some drop cloths just to keep the sanding down, because I use this shop for more than just surfboard building, and getting dust everywhere is not great. It is a real pain to clean, let me tell you. On the previous surfboard last year, I did cover everything up, but I still spent like an hour vacuuming and cleaning every individual tool and everything in the shop. So yeah, cover stuff up. Also, I forgot to mention why I'm going to sand this. You might think, oh, this looks really good. Why don't I just install the leash plug and take it surfing? Well, it's because even though it's a hot coat, even though it looks really good and smooth, up close you can still see little bumps, little tiny waves in it. What ends up happening is it does give it that wavy look, and that's not what I'm going for. I want to go for, this time, a showroom glossy finish. So that's why I'm sanding it. So I'm going to get rid of the kind of the orange peel look to it, sand it, and then I'm going to do a gloss coat on it, which will be even smoother, sand that again, and then that will become the final finish. This is just some cut up bath mats. Really great grip. I put between the surfboard and the surfboard stand. Keeps it from sliding around when I go to sand this. Alright, it's time to do some sanding. So, what do I need for sanding? Well, I'm going to use my good old reliable Milwaukee variable speed automotive polisher. This thing works awesome. If you don't have one of these, you can also use a random orbital sander. Those work really well. It's just it'll take you a lot longer because it's, you know, the sanding pad's only this big as opposed to like a sanding pad this big. Speaking of sanding pads, to fit on this sander, this has a 5/8 arbor. These pads that you can buy, Greenlight Surf Supply, they screw on and then you use it just like a polisher, sander. I have this one here, the red one, a medium, and I also have a yellow. I don't generally bother with the hard pad because that's really only for fin boxes, so I'm not doing that right now, but I will use that later on. You need a good respirator or dust mask because it's going to get dusty and you don't want to be breathing in the fiberglass or epoxy dust. I also have a hand sanding block. I'm going to manually sand the rails just because it's a little safer. You have a little more control. You could certainly do the rails with a random orbital sander or a palm sander. That would speed things up. Mine's actually looking pretty smooth, so I'm not too worried about it. I'm just going to hand sand it. I'm going to start off with 100 grit. Normally, ideally, maybe 120, 150. I ran out of both, so I'm going to use 100. Flatten everything that's flat. Sand everything smooth so it matches to get rid of this bubbly orange peel kind of look on it, even though it looks pretty good. I also forgot to mention these sanding pads. For the sandpaper, I just use sheets of sandpaper. I cut them out into circles, spray some Super 77 on the pad or the piece of paper, and I just stick it to it, like this one over here. And we'll start sanding. I'm going to hand sand the rails first just to blend everything in, get rid of that tape line. And once that's gone, I'll power sand all the flats with the power sander, and then we'll go do the gloss coat. This is the tape line that I'm going to sand first, just to get rid of that. Just blend in the rail by hand because I don't want to power sand this because you can sand through very quickly. I'm not too worried about sand through since I'm doing a gloss coat anyway, so I'll sand all that down. So there you can see right here, see how even though it looks smooth, it's really not. And when you get it in light, it'll reflect weird because of this orange peel-y effect. So you can see right here, there's these little tiny divots. So I'm sanding off the high spots. So this gives you an idea. The finish is not flat, even though it looks like it's really shiny and looks real good. Also, back here at the tail, I'm gonna sand this so it's 90 degrees and then sand this parallel to the deck. So we'll get a nice sharp edge on the last, whatever, 18 to 24 inches. I'm switching to my softer pad to sand the rest of the deck, as it conforms to the deck contours a lot better than the medium pad. You want to sand the board so that you get rid of all of the little bumps and ripples. Keep sanding so that the whole board loses its shine and it's smooth and even. The better job you do sanding, the better the gloss coat will come out. Also, use good quality sandpaper. The cheaper the paper, the more it will clog. Once the sandpaper gets worn out, change it, as it won't sand the epoxy anymore and all it's going to do is generate heat, which isn't good. While not particularly interesting, I left in a lot of the sanding footage to give you a sense of how much work it takes to make a surfboard that looks like one that you would find at a surf shop. It takes so much sanding to make a perfect looking board. No wonder they're so expensive. Okay, sanding is done. Next up, gonna clean up because this place is dusty. A 10-foot board creates a lot of dust. All right, time to start vacuuming. Look at this place. It's just a disaster in terms of dust, but the board looks great. Very smooth, not too many sand throughs. Very happy with it. I'm gonna have to pull the plastic down because I want this Glosscoat to be dust free. And that's really hard because every time I walk by and even just any air current from when I'm just passing by the plastic, it froze up dust like crazy. So yeah, gonna have to do that. Especially if this cheaper plastic, because it's so thin. I'll pull it down and put it back up when I go to sand the Glosscoat. I need to put something over my coffee so I don't get any dust in it. So I've switched out the stands. I've put it back up onto the glassing stands because it makes it easier for hot coating, or in this case gloss coating. I do want to do a pinstripe on the deck of the board. Unfortunately, I'm waiting on some acrylic paint. So I'm not going to, normally I would gloss the deck first and then do the bottom. But since I'm waiting on that paint, I figured I'll just do the bottom of the board first. It's fine, it's not a big deal. I did try using resin, epoxy resin, and some tint in it to make a pinstripe like I did on this test piece here. The only problem is I find the epoxy is a little too thick, and trying to sand and feather it in is just harder. I certainly could make it thinner. The only issue is I think my pigment might not be dark enough and I could have a little bit of bleed through. Might be able to see a little bit of the, I don't know, imperfections in between the two, between the cut lap, because I'm going to use this to hide my crimes on the cut lap. Because my plan is to put a pinstripe and then gloss coat the deck, that way I can polish it to a high gloss finish. The issue with putting the pinstripe on top, which I've done before, on top of the gloss coat, is what ends up happening is if you've polished it too shiny, that paint or whatever you're putting on could have adhesion issues. Ideally, you want to do it around the 400, 600 grit, but if I'm taking it up to a showroom finish, I need to take it up to like 1200 to 2000 grit, and then polish, so it'd be too slippery. And to get it to match and be glossy, the pinstripe to be glossy with the rest of the board, it just could be some issues. So I want to try to get this pinstripe underneath the gloss coat. So after I get the pinstriping, the gloss coating done, I'm going to install the remaining fin box, the leash plug, the vent plugs, and then after that I'll be able to do the final sanding, which won't be nearly as involved as the hot coat sanding, which made this place super dusty. I'll probably start off at a finer grit and then do wet sanding, polish, and call it done. Getting close. Getting close. Yeah. Really loving it so far. Probably one of my best finishes yet. Although I say that on every board. So we'll see. Continuous improvement. Oh, and before you do the gloss coat, clean everything super, super really good. Vacuum out all the dust. Clean the board off really well. I am going to wipe this down with some either denatured alcohol, methyl hydrate, or my personal favorite is I like wiping it down with acetone. But if you don't want to work with acetone or you don't have any methyl hydrate, even like 100% isopropyl alcohol will work fine. And then tape all around the board like I did for the hot coat. So that there's the sand through, but that'll all get covered up by the gloss coat. So here's the gloss coat done, but you can kind of see all these little dots, and it looks like, well, I used to think it was dust, but I just had a revelation and I realized what it is. It's the paraffin that is dissolved in the additive F that I add to the epoxy as a surfacing agent that helps prevent fish eyes, and it helps the epoxy wet out. But the paraffin hasn't completely dissolved, and you can see it throughout the board. And this has happened to me, well, pretty much through most boards that I've made. And it's not dust. I always thought it was dust settling in on the epoxy, but it's paraffin. Now, I might try on the deck not adding any additive F, which is all it is xylene with paraffin wax dissolved in it, and see what happens. As long as my surface is nice and clean, I shouldn't have an issue. But anyways, hopefully this comes up on the camera, but you can just see those little specks. It's so glossy that it's really hard to show. Everywhere you can see light. Oh, you gotta like that. That pulled so easy. Awesome. I'm sanding down with 320 where I'm going to do the pinstripe. I just want this to be a little smoother, so when I lay down the pinstripe, I don't get much wicking underneath the masking tape, because that can happen. I'm going to mask off the pin line, and the way I do that, I should be wearing a glove, but my hand's pretty clean from just messing with acetone to wipe down the board. Not ideal, not the best thing for you, but anyways. Is when you're working with a tape line, have your tape really long so that way you can manipulate it really easy. Don't have it all choke up really close so that way you only have this much to move. Have it really far back, have your hand back here, and then as you're applying the tape, you just put your hand down, and then you use your left hand, or this is my left, this is my right, to guide, and then slowly put the tape down, and then manipulate and make the tape longer, because you don't want to put in sharp, quick curves because it won't look good to the eye. So when I look down the board, see how nice that loops or curves? And that's a technique that's used by, well, typically people who paint cars or anyone that needs to mask something off, but in particularly in the refinishing industry. Now, the reason why I'm laying down this pinstripe, I'm putting this tape directly on top of the cut lap where the color meets the white, is because I want to have a pin line that's equal distance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay down this tape, and then I'm going to tape on either side and then pull up this piece of tape, and that'll leave me with the proper width all the way across. Because otherwise, if I try to tape one side and then the other side of the line, you're going to have like some gaps. Some people can do it really well. I'm not that type of person, so I'm going to just put this down as a guide first. Okay, I'm going to use some acrylic paint here, satin. Hopefully this stuff will hold up over time because, you know, all paints will fade with UV light. But the epoxy does have UV blockers built into it, so we'll see how this goes. Well, I see my finger does a better job than the foam brush, so finger it is. Alright, time to pull the tape. It's been a couple hours. I'm going to let this set up. Once I pull the tape, I'm going to have a look at it, see what it looks like, see if it's any good. If it's not good, I'll wipe it down and try something else. And then I'll let it go for a day or two to let the acrylic paint harden up, and then I'll just touch it up with a little bit of sandpaper, wipe down the board, and then gloss coat. That came out really good. I got nice sharp lines, no bleeding through the tape. So now I'm going to let this set up, and then I'm going to sand it. Just lightly sand it with maybe some 600, and then gloss coat time. Yeah, that looks really good. Nice and sharp, nice arcing lines. Happy with that. Now the only thing I'm doing here is I just want to sand smooth just a tiny bit to remove the edge. And I'm going to wipe this down with some clean distilled water, because I don't really want to hit this with acetone or denatured alcohol or anything like that, because that will wash off the acrylic paint, or it has a chance of washing it off because it's a stronger solvent. So I got a little distilled water here. I'm just going to wipe down the board. So I've pretty much got it all. It's not green anymore. I'll let this dry, and then we'll gloss coat. Now that the pinstripes dried for a day, I've wiped down the board with distilled water. I've also re-wiped the center of the board and the edge of the board with some acetone. Going to do another layer of tape just below that spot where we did the previous gloss coat, just like a millimeter underneath that edge. And then we'll gloss coat it. I switched over to some of the thinner masking tape, the 1-inch masking tape, because it just conforms to the curve of the board a little better for this. So back here where it transitions from the softer rail, the curved rail with the tuck, into the hard rail back here, what I normally do is I kind of come back and then I kind of go underneath like that. And then this back here, I just slip the epoxy strip around, or sometimes I'll do this. I'll tape it like that. So the epoxy will have a place to kind of pool, and it gives me lots to sand to get that really nice sharp edge. I've mentioned it multiple times in all my other videos, but it's always good to repeat it. All right, so it's been about a half an hour since I've coated the board, and I thought that this might happen because I have experience in this in the past, is that the paint, the acrylic paint, obviously still has some residual oils in it. And even though I've sanded it and wiped it, some spots are still kind of bleeding through. So the epoxy has a little bit of a hard time not sticking to it. So it's kind of what you would call a fisheye. So I'm just gonna cheat. And I'm gonna come back now that the board is set up a little bit and use a little bit of epoxy that I've just gathered off the some of the tape. And I'm just gonna go over some of those points here. Even though it's gonna be a little high, it'll smooth out a little bit. And then over time, it'll level out. And then when I come back to sand it, I'll blend it all in. So I'm just going to go around the board and make sure that there's no other spots. I had only a handful, maybe like 4 or 5, but it's enough to cause you some issues. This is what happens when you let it sit overnight. It gets a little harder to pull, but it's still possible because this is on the Glosscoat. Tape tends to break off in pieces. Also, if you use cheap tape, this makes it really frustrating. I used a little bit of the cheap tape because I ran out because of the whole COVID thing. Try to avoid doing it if you absolutely can. Well, gonna end the video here. Sanding is so much work and it creates a real mess, but it's a necessary step to get a super smooth finish. In the next video, I installed the center fin box and vent plugs. We're getting really close to finishing, so guys, I'll see you in the next video. And give this video a thumbs up if you found it helpful, or if you like watching me get dusty.